Hi, my name's Sarah Frankland. I'm the Validation Regulatory Manager for Bouygues Energy and Services. I'd like to talk to you about the importance of validation in project development. I'm going to unlock your knowledge in validation, but where to start? Validation should have a life cycle approach. You actually need to look at the end to figure out where you need to begin with. For example, you want to build an extension onto your current facility. You need to focus on what you want to achieve at the end. For example, a well-built structure that will pass all planning regulation and actually suits your requirements. You'll have to begin with employing an architect to draw up plans that can be submitted for planning permission. You may even want to engage with a project manager or a specific turnkey company like Bouygues to supervise the build. They'll need to source all the relevant materials and ensure they're sticking to an agreed time frame. Along the way, the evaluation of the build will be regular building inspections and checks against planning drawings. At the end, you're deploying it, but how do you evaluate it works? Does it meet all your acceptance criteria? For example, is it built with the correct materials shown on the plan? Do the electrics work? Was it built with an acceptable time frame? At the end, you should have an extension to your facility that is fit for purpose, but that's not quite the end, and this is where the life cycle approach comes in. You might want to revisit that extension to your facility to check that it still meets regulations. You may even want to change the design, so then you go back to the initial planning and start the whole life process again. Initially, when you're setting the stage for validation activities, it begins with several paperwork exercises. So to begin with, you start with the validation master plan. The Validation Master Plan is a site-specific overarching document that covers all your validation activities and any regulatory requirements for the facility. The VMP should be a document that also has the validation state of any existing equipment and systems, including any ongoing qualification that needs to be performed. Also, you can also have project-specific validation master plans. These are more in-depth description of validation activities specific to a certain project. For example, when I was talking about the extension to facility, you would cover the modifications in this project VMP, how these are going to be controlled and what regulatory requirements are needed. You may also want to perform an assessment of equipment to determine what level of validation is required. This can be in the form of a matrix stating expected validation activities for each system and who is responsible. Non-critical equipment that have no effect on safety or product quality do not require validation. The VMP needs input from all relevant departments, for example, the design team, equipment subject matter experts and process engineers. The user requirement specification is a key document used throughout validation lifecycle. It should be referred back to when you're looking at further validation activities later on. It's basically a list where you spell out the requirements. It says, this is what I want from the system or the equipment. Producing a URS involves background research and information from several inputs. You'll want to look at the overall process, spell out a step-by-step description detailing the ranges of critical process parameters. Also, you might want to look at critical quality attributes of the final product to ensure you meet these requirements. You might also want to look at the equipment and spell out any expected performances that are needed. You'll also want to look at more specific requirements as well. For example, what utilities are required, any health and safety requirements. Also spell out any documentation you require, for example, certificates, calibration certificates. The URS should be a living document and it can be updated throughout the project lifecycle to reflect any changes to the client's requirements. The design qualification again is another paperwork exercise. It's there to ensure that all your requirements have been captured during the design stage. So you cross-reference them back to the URS. Here, for example, you can see we spell out in the URS that we need full technical drawings. When we've checked the design for this facility, we can see we've got full technical drawings, therefore we've met that requirement. And you work your way through each of the requirements to ensure that you can capture this requirement in the design stage before you progress to any further activities. The next step in the process is to perform a factory acceptance test on a piece of equipment or system. This should be performed at the vendor site for systems that have complex design. The reason to perform the factory acceptance test is it reduces the risk of having a faulty piece of equipment being delivered to site. It's also a really good opportunity to learn about the equipment from the experts while you're witnessing the FAT. For complex systems as well, it's common practice to perform a site acceptance test. This replicates elements of the FAT to ensure the delivered goods have not been damaged in transit. An FAT and SAT, if performed well, can be leveraged against some IQ and OQ activities where the relocation of the system or the equipment doesn't impact the validity of the tests. Over the next few slides, I will give a streamlined approach to installation, operational and performance qualification. An IQ protocol will verify that the equipment is installed in accordance with the design and user requirement specification. IQ activities may include, but is not limited to, the following. For example, you'll want to compare that the received equipment matches the purchase order. You want to verify that the environment is suitable for use. For example, is the temperature correct? Is it got the correct humidity for that piece of equipment? You want to power it up and ensure that it can power up. You'll also want to look at any specific drawings to make sure, for example, PID or pneumatic drawings, that the design is correct. You also want to check verification of the utilities. For example, if it needs 3-bar steam, ensure that you can supply 3-bar steam for the installation. Also, for some piece of equipment, you may have spelled out that it needs to be made of a certain material. Again, for example, 316 stainless steel is quite common in the farming industry. You'd expect to see a certificate with that piece of material, and you would check that as part of the installation. Operational qualification will check that the piece of equipment operates as expected and checks against the user requirement specifications and normal conditions. For example, you may be checking that it comes with calibration certificates or you perform an on-site calibration. You also want to check that any alarms on the system work as expected, and if it runs to any limits, that it can run within these limits. You'll also want to maybe produce a standard operating procedure and train operators while you've got the subject matter experts on site installing the piece of equipment and checking it. You'll also want to do basic operational checks. For example, if you've got a mixer, you'll want to check that you can fit a mixing head to it, and as you turn the dial up and down, the speed lowers or increases as expected. Performance qualification will verify that the system performs as intended under vendor-specific operating conditions. It shows that it meets all your predetermined specifications and acceptance criteria. PQ studies should also show that the system performance is reproducible and acceptable. For example, with a mixer before, you want to check now that the mixer can mix multiple different liquids of different viscosity. That's where it's site-specific for your performance qualification. You should also perform a risk assessment which will determine ongoing performance checks for critical systems. For example, you would want to do ongoing viable and non-viable monitoring of clean rooms, or you may also have an autoclave in your facility. You won't want to just do a one-off performance qualification of the autoclave. You'd want to make sure that you do ongoing thermometric mapping testing of the autoclave to ensure it performs as expected, as it's a critical piece of kit. Facilities may also need to perform process validation, cleaning validation and computer system validations. At the end of the validation activity, it's crucial to produce a validation summary report to document all results, including any noted discrepancies. As I said previously, I'm the validation manager for Bouygues Energy and Services, but who are we? We've got over 50 years experience working within the pharma industry. We're a design and build partnership that offers sustainable engineering solutions. Our services include front-end studies, design and engineering, construction and fit-out, my role, regulatory affairs and validation, and we also offer ongoing service and maintenance of sites. Thank you for listening to our presentation.